Have you ever wondered what secrets the land of Iran was hiding beneath its red dust long before the great Persian empires rose and fell? Long before mighty armies swept across it like storm winds over dry grass? And if I told you that, in the searing plains of Khuzestan, there once stood a sacred city built not merely for human beings to live in, but for the gods themselves to descend into, a place once bright with incense smoke, prayer, and the faith of an entire civilization, only to be left behind in silence, in wind, in sand, as though someone had quietly closed the door on an ancient world and thrown the key into the dark. Would you want to walk into that place with me tonight? Because this story is not only about old bricks, and it is not only about a ruined monument. This is the story of a land that once held one of humanity's greatest dreams, and then buried that dream inside itself. And to understand why the forgotten Ziggurat of Chogha Zanbil came to exist, we have to begin very early indeed. Back when Khuzestan was still a burning breath of wet earth, rivers, blazing sunlight, and humankind's sacred fear before the universe. Imagine a land far to the southwest of modern-day Iran, where summer can crack the earth beneath your feet, where the wind carries dry heat and the salty taste of distant waters, where great rivers like the Karun and the Karkad twist through the plain like silver snakes, feeding life in a place that seems made only for sunfire and red dust. In that age, when the map of the world was not yet called by the names we know now, when humanity's first cities still wore the half-mythic, half-real face of the earliest civilizations, Khuzestan was already a special land. It was not only a place where crops rose from alluvial soil, not only a place where livestock moved under the punishing glare of the sun, not only a place where human beings built their first settlements beside the water. It was also a crossroads of power, belief, anxiety, ambition, and sacred imagination. Every great civilization, in its beginning, is afraid of nature, but it is precisely because people are afraid that they learn to worship. And from worship, they begin building their first symbols. Khuzestan was never a gentle land in the easy sense. It gave life, but demanded obedience in return. The people who lived there had to learn how to read the water, understand when the silt would come, when the ground would harden, when the sky would blaze, and when the fields would be saved by the river. In a world where human beings did not control nature, every change of season felt like the will of invisible powers. Rain was not only water. Drought was not only hardship. Flood was not only disaster. All of it was the language of the gods. And in lands like Khuzestan, where life and death stood so close together, religion was never a decorative layer laid over existence. It was the spine of the world. That is also why this region became, from a very early time, one of the hearts of the ancient civilization of Elam, a civilization so old that many people today rarely speak its name, yet one that existed for thousands of years beside Mesopotamia, trading, warring, building cities, temples, rituals, and a spiritual world of its own. Elam is not the first name people usually mention, the way they do with Egypt or Babylon, and that only makes it more mysterious. Because there are civilizations that grow darker and more compelling the less they are remembered by popular memory. As though time itself had deliberately covered their faces with a hand of sand and dust. And in the middle of that darkness, Khuzestan was once one of their most important cradles. Picture those ancient mornings on that plain. The sun rose quickly and harshly. Not gently as it does in colder lands. Light did not seem to spread here so much as pour down. Flashing silver off the water. Pulling vapor from the mud. Stretching the shadows of people and livestock long over the earth still damp from the night. In the distance stood clusters of mud brick homes. Grain stores. Herds. And the sound of people calling to one another in a language most of us will never hear again. And then, rising out of that ordinary life, the temples began to appear, small at first, then larger, taller, heavier, as if the people of this land understood very early that if they were going to survive amid the uncertainty of nature, they needed to build a bridge toward the sacred. Not only with prayer, but with stone, with brick, with towers, with things that could be touched, seen, and made to stand against the heat and against time. A civilization only truly believes in its gods when it is willing to pour labor, wealth, and political life into building a place for those gods to dwell. In a night like this, if you close your eyes, you may feel it even more clearly. A broad, low, burning land, where life clings to rivers the way roots cling to soil. Where human beings are made to feel small under a sky too vast to bear. Where each season, each wind, each shift of earth and weather can easily be understood as a reminder that mankind is not the master. Only a tenant among forces much larger than itself. From that feeling, religion was born. From that feeling, rulers learned to bind their thrones to the divine. From that feeling, temples became the center of life, not only places of worship, but places where wealth was stored, rituals were performed, and political authority was joined to the universe itself. And from that very feeling, a structure as immense as Chogha Zanbil could one day be imagined. But at this early point in the story, we do not need to rush too quickly toward the great Ziggurat. We need to linger a little longer over the land that made it possible. Khuzestan did not only nourish crops and people, it nourished religious imagination. Here, the gods were not experienced as distant abstractions. They were close, in the water, in the wind, in the sun, in the flood, in the harvest, in victory and defeat. And once the gods are felt that close, rulers cannot govern by sword alone. They must also govern through ritual, through sacred connection, through proving that they stand not only at the head of humanity, but under the approval of the unseen powers. In such a place, politics and religion are not two separate roads. They are the same river. That is why ancient Khuzestan was not only a land of fields and walls. It was a land of humanity's deepest fears and greatest ambitions. A king did not want only the obedience of his people. He wanted his name recognized by the gods. He wanted his city to become a center of the known world. He wanted what he built to outlast not just his own life, but many lives after him. And when the fear of being forgotten meets the desire to be sanctified, great monuments begin to rise, not only to house people, but to be seen from far away. To make the heart tremble, to remind everyone that here, in this land of blazing heat and mud, between the fields and the rivers, there is a place where heaven and earth touch. Do you see? Even now, before Chogha Zanbil itself has yet appeared on the horizon of the story, its atmosphere is already taking shape. It is being woven out of the heat of Khuzestan, Out of the wealth and anxiety of Elamite civilization. Out of fear of nature. Out of faith in divine power. Out of political authority needing some great visible form in which to declare itself. Without this land, these rivers, this punishing sky, this fear and this faith, there would never have been a sacred city raised out of the plain as a challenge to time. Chogha Zanbil was not a miracle dropped from heaven. It was the result of centuries of people looking at the world around them and concluding that they needed to build something greater than homes. Greater than walls. Greater even than an ordinary capital city. A place not for daily life alone, but for the sacred itself. And then, when evening slowly fell over ancient Khuzestan, when the sunlight withdrew from the burning earth, when the wind carried the smell of river mud and dry grass, when the first fires were lit in the settlements and older temples, perhaps that was also when the first thoughts of a city for the gods began to gather in the minds of Elam's rulers. Because night is always when human beings feel most clearly the distance between themselves and the universe. Day still holds farming, building, war, voices, work, but night, beneath a sky too wide, reminds human beings how small they are, how fragile, how easily swept away. It is in nights like that that civilizations begin dreaming their greatest dreams. Perhaps on one far-off night, inside the Elamite palace, under torchlight flickering across earthen walls, a king looked out into the darkness and asked himself whether it might be possible to raise a place so holy that the gods would not turn away from it. A place large enough that his name would continue living after his own body had become dust. That is the moment when Khuzestan ceased to be merely a setting. It became the cradle of an idea at once sacred, political, proud, and afraid, the idea that human beings could stack brick high enough to draw nearer to heaven. That a king could concentrate his power into a monument so imposing that generations yet unborn would be forced to look up at it. That a city might be built not for trade or war but to become the center of belief itself. But every great dream carries within it the seed of mystery. And often the curse of time as well. Because the grander, holier, and more deliberately immortal a thing is, the more haunting it becomes when it is abandoned. And that is the doorway we are about to step through in the next part of the story. When King Untash Gal appears. When the dream of a sacred city ceases to be a vague thought and begins turning into brick, into wall, into stair, into ziggurat, into a colossal monument rising from the plain, and with it begins the road toward a mystery that, thousands of years later, still makes people look at it with a mixture of awe and sorrow. And it is through that doorway, from the moment when a land is no longer merely land and a sky is no longer merely sky, when everything has begun to feel like the quiet summons of something greater than mankind, that our story tonight must move deeper, into the place where thought becomes ambition. Ambition becomes vow, and vow becomes stone, brick, wall, and stair large enough to challenge time itself. Because there always comes a moment in history when a king is no longer satisfied with ruling only what the eye can see. He wants more than that. He wants to touch the sacred. He wants his name not merely written in the chronicle of men, but to ring out as something the gods themselves have acknowledged. And in ancient Elam, in that blazing land of Khuzestan, the man who carried a dream so vast it almost bordered on madness was Untash Gal. Picture an early morning in Elam. when the sun has not yet risen too high, when the heat of the day has not yet settled over the plain with all its weight, when in the royal palace servants move quietly, scribes hold clay tablets in their hands, priests prepare the rituals of the dawn, and at the center of it all sits one man in the still soft light with a mind that is anything but soft. A king living in a world where power and divinity are bound together cannot think like an ordinary ruler. He is not concerned only with grain, taxes, borders, or disputes between people. He must also think about where he stands before the gods, about how kingship can be made legitimate not only through force but through holiness, about how his name might continue living when his breath is gone. Untash Gal must have been haunted by exactly those questions. Today we know him as the Elamite king who built Chogha Zanbil. But at the beginning of this story he was not yet the immortal figure tied forever to those bricks still lying beneath the sun of Khuzestan. He was simply a man standing inside a very ancient world, one where kingdoms rose and fell, where gods were worshipped with both fear and demand, where glory and oblivion were separated by little more than a few wars, a few floods, a few generations of lesser heirs. Perhaps Untash Gal saw that too clearly. He understood that a kingdom could be rich, but wealth alone could not grant immortality. An army could be strong, but victory on the battlefield would one day be buried under a newer layer of dust. A palace could be magnificent, but if it was not tied to the sacred, it was still only a place where men lived for one lifetime. And so in his mind there emerged a dream that did not belong to ordinary things at all. A dream of building a place where people would not only see the king's power, but feel that the gods themselves truly lived there. What made that dream so great and so mysterious was that Untash Gal did not merely want to build another temple in an already existing city. He wanted to found an entirely new sacred city, a religious center immense enough to gather many currents of Elamite worship, many gods, many beliefs, into one place, as if he wanted to reshape physical space into the form of a reordered cosmos. This was no small decision. It was an act of tremendous confidence, but also the mark of a mind unwilling to do only what was sufficient. Building a city for the living was already hard. Building a city for the gods was something greater still, because then every brick had to stand not only under sun and wind, but beneath the spiritual ambition of an entire dynasty. And perhaps Untash Gal understood that perfectly. It may even be why he wanted it all the more. Tonight, we need to pause here long enough to feel how large that dream really was. In the ancient world, especially in places like Elam, where nature was both generous and brutal, people did not pour labor, wealth, time, ritual, and political power into an empty gesture. Anything built on a grand scale had to carry meaning beyond ordinary life. If walls were built, they were to defend. If canals were cut, they were to feed the people. If a temple was raised, it was to connect human beings with the gods. But Untash Gal wanted more than a temple. He wanted a city whose very existence would say something to the world. That Elam was not merely a land of war, trade, and the powers of earth and water, but a place that possessed a sacred center, an artificial mountain, a gate toward heaven. Perhaps that excess itself is why Chogha Zanbil carried from the very beginning an air of both grandeur and fate, as all dreams that reach too high often do. Can you imagine the way Untash Gal looked at Khuzestan? Not simply as farmland or waterway, but as a broad, hot, open canvas, grand enough to bear a structure that would change the entire horizon. A structure that could not be swallowed by ordinary settlement, that could not dissolve into the plain life of villages and crops, but had to rise like a declaration made in brick. Perhaps he looked toward the land near Susa, the older center of Elamite power, and understood that he needed another place, a new place, one that could be dedicated from the beginning to this vision. And when a king begins looking at geography as a painter looks at an empty surface, history is usually preparing to let the earth itself be shaped by human will. But Untash Gal was not merely a man of earthly power. He was also a man who understood that no dream this large could stand in that land without the gods. Perhaps the rituals in the palace, the sacrifices, the prayers of the priests, the night skies so immense it could make even a king feel small, all of it deepened his sense that true kingship had to place itself beneath the shadow of the sacred. And from that feeling, the idea of a sacred city became more than an architectural or political project. It became an act of theology, an attempt to plant something into the earth and then build upward from it a living axis joining heaven and man. Divinity and dynasty, power and immortality. Great rulers of the ancient world rarely wanted only to be feared. They wanted to be revered. They wanted to be confirmed by a deeper order. Untash Gal was no different. And in thought, Chogha Zanbil was already a tool of that longing. But every dream that reaches toward heaven must still pass through earth. And that is part of what makes Untash Gal's story so compelling. Because in order to build something for the gods, he still had to begin with very human things. He had to choose the ground. He had to command. He had to mobilize labor. He had to gather materials. He had to make priests, nobles, craftsmen, and ordinary people believe that this was not the passing vanity of a king hungry for glory, but a work worthy of pouring whole lives into. You see, even inside the most sacred dream, the king still had to work like a political mind of great skill. And that, perhaps, is what makes Untash Gal worth remembering. He did not only dream, he knew how to turn a dream into a structure. That is the line between a man who clings to fantasy and one who creates history. If we listen a little more closely tonight, we can almost feel the atmosphere that must have gathered around him. The consultations with priests, the first inscriptions, the discussions over where the temple city should rise, the repeated reading of omens, signs, celestial cycles, water, and soil. In the ancient world, no one built a sacred city the way one drove a stake into the ground at random. Everything had to begin with ritual, with invocation, with the certainty that the place itself had been chosen. And here the story of Chogha Zanbil begins to take on the color of destiny. Because once a monument is conceived not merely to serve human life, but to become a point of meeting between man and God, every brick laid down already carries another layer of meaning. It is no longer only material. It is a vow made solid. Perhaps in those first days, Khuzestan still looked like Khuzestan always had. The wind moved over the plain. The rivers carried silt. People tended fields and herds, living the ordinary life of the land. But somewhere, in Untash Gal's gaze, everything had already changed. Because when a king decides to raise something vast enough to demand remembrance across thousands of years, then from that moment the earth beneath it is no longer ordinary earth. It becomes a foundation waiting to happen, a silence waiting to be filled by hammers, bricks, prayers, and the footsteps of countless people, many of whom probably never knew they were helping create a mystery that would outlive every one of their own names. That, to me, is what makes this part of the story so beautiful and so sad. Because we know now, from thousands of years later, that the monument will become a ruin, that the sacred city will be abandoned. But Untash Gal did not know that. When he dreamed sincerely. When he gave the order, he believed in the permanence of what he was building. And it is that belief that makes everything feel solemn. There is something deeply moving about human beings continuing to build great things even though time is always waiting to crack them, scatter them, sink them back into dust. But if no one ever dared believe that way, there would be no Chogha Zanbil. There would be no great Ziggurat rising out of Khuzestan like a brick heart of Elamite faith. Imagine the first evening after the decision had been made. Untash Gal may have stood on some slight rise and looked out over an empty stretch of land. The place that would one day be enclosed by walls, ceremonial courts, shrines, storehouses, stairways, and the massive ziggurat itself. The night wind moved over the plain. The sky was black. The stars lay above him like silent divine eyes. And in that moment, perhaps he did not see an empty space at all. He saw the whole sacred city already complete. That is one of the strange gifts of people who change history. They see beforehand what everyone else will only see afterward. They move through the not yet as if it were already present. And perhaps in that moment Chogha Zanbil was truly born. Not in brick, but in the imagination of a king who wanted to build the gods a place to descend into, and through it carve for himself a road into immortality. Still, every great dream must pass through the first test of reality. From here on, Untash Gal could no longer remain only the man who saw it. He had to become the man who could make thousands of other hands see it too. He had to make builders, potters, laborers, those who hauled brick, those who dug foundations, those who guarded supplies, priests, and ritual keepers all understand that they were not simply working for the king. They were touching something greater than themselves. A sacred city cannot be built by command alone. It needs belief. It needs a whole system of people willing to believe that what they are raising will join them to the gods and carry their dynasty beyond time. And perhaps this is where Untash Gal showed that he was not merely a dreamer. He was a man who knew how to turn dream into command. Command into ritual, ritual into labor, and labor into brick and stone with a soul. And so, under the heat of Khuzestan, in a land that had long learned to live with rivers, dust, blazing sky, and fear of the gods, a king began pulling the world toward the vision he had already seen within himself. From here, nothing would be quite the same again. The ground would be cut open. Bricks would be fired. Inscriptions naming the gods and the king would begin to appear. Rituals would be held to call the divine to witness each new stage. And in all of that, under the heat, the dust, the sweat, the smoke, and the sound of labor, Untash Gal's dream would begin moving from the invisible into the visible. A sacred city would start to rise, not only to astonish the people living in that age, but so that thousands of years later, when only ruins remained. Others would still ask what could have moved one man, one dynasty, one civilization to build something so immense, only to let it fall at last into abandonment on the plain. And because that question has already begun forming inside us, the next part of the story can no longer stop at the dream alone. Now the dream must pass into hands, into soil, into brick, into kiln smoke, and into the sweat of thousands of people. Because once Untash Gal had seen the city of the gods in his mind, nothing remained except to lay down the first brick, so that from there all of Chogha Zanbil might begin lifting itself out of the earth like an artificial mountain in the middle of Khuzestan. At once the pride of Elam and the mystery that time did not yet know how deeply it would one day have to bury. And once the dream no longer lay only in Untash Gal's mind. Once it had crossed the line from thought into command, vow, ritual, and labor, the land of Khuzestan began to change as well. From that moment on, the ground that had once only lain beneath the sun, beneath the wind, beneath the feet of farmers, herders, priests, and warriors, became a body preparing for a great transformation. Because every grand monument, before it rises as brick and stone, must pass through a stage that is almost sacred in itself, the stage when the ground is not yet truly a foundation, but already a place of waiting, when emptiness is no longer emptiness, but promise. And Chogha Zanbil, from that very instant, had begun entering history in exactly that way. We can imagine the first days of construction as something both very real and almost mystical. The sun rose early over the Khuzestan plain, pouring down hard and fast, drying the ground into reddish-brown crusts, while the air held the smell of clay, dry grass, river mud, and human bodies. From many directions, people began arriving: builders, diggers, men hauling clay and water, workers tending kilns, brickmakers, scribes, priests walking beside them to speak the necessary prayers as each new stage was opened. And somewhere inside that human movement, under the eyes of royal officials, each act of labor must already have been tied to something larger than itself. No one was only building a wall. No one was only dragging a cart of brick. All of them were laying hands on what would become the sacred heart of a holy city. The strange thing about monuments like this is that when we look back across thousands of years, we usually see only the surviving brick and forget the people who once made it live. But if we are going to tell the story properly, in the stillness of night, then we have to call them back. We have to see the muddy hands, the backs darkened with sweat, the bare feet crossing hot ground, the arms lifting wet bricks and passing them from one person to another. We have to hear the shouted rhythms of work, the creak of wooden wheels, the splash of water into mixing pits, the crackle of fuel in the kilns, the sound of bricks being turned from the fire, dark red and still holding the heat of the earth itself. Because a sacred city does not rise from the king's will alone. It is born from human effort, from collective breath, from countless small lives bent beneath the weight of a dream too large for any one of them. And perhaps this is where the first quiet beauty of Chogha Zanbil appears. Before it became a ziggurat, before it became a ruin, before it became a mystery, it was once a living construction site, a body growing a little larger each day, where earth, water, fire, and human hands joined together to make architecture. Clay was taken from the plain itself, the same soil that nourished crops. Then mixed with water, pressed into molds, dried in the sun and finally hardened in fire. Every brick was born that way, not only as material, but almost as though Khuzestan itself had been cut apart and reshaped into the form of belief. Every great monument belongs deeply to the place it rises from. It does not merely stand on the land. It is made of it. And no matter how large Chogha Zanbil would become, how high, how sacred, at its deepest level it would still be Khuzestan lifting itself upward into the shape of faith. The Elamites of that time probably did not see construction as merely practical labor. During those first stages, there must also have been ritual. Perhaps prayers were spoken before the foundations were marked. Perhaps offerings were made to the gods so that permission to begin might be granted. Perhaps the corners of the site were marked by gestures we no longer fully understand, though they must have carried enormous meaning at the time. In the ancient world, no one laid out the plan of a sacred city the way one marked a storage yard. The foundation was the first covenant, a covenant between king and gods, between the living and the dwelling place of the unseen, between the present of one dynasty and the hunger to reach beyond death. Untash Gal must have understood that perfectly. So the earliest steps of the project were not only technical, they were ritual carried out through technique. Imagine the moment when the first foundation line was fixed. The air may have gone still for a moment. The workers may have paused. A priest stepped forward. Smoke from incense or sacrifice rose into the heat. Prayers were spoken in an ancient language that survives today only in fragments of broken inscription. And at the center of it all, the ground itself was named, awakened, and compelled to become something other than ordinary land. From that point on, it was no longer just another stretch of earth in the plain. It had become the base of an axis joining heaven and mankind. That is when Chogha Zanbil first began to acquire a soul. Then, day by day, the monument began to rise. First the enclosing walls, then the courts, the passageways, the ceremonial spaces, and finally, from the center of all of it, the ziggurat itself slowly took shape. In the imagination of people now, it is easy to see the completed monument at once colossal, solitary, towering under the sky, but while it was still being built, the site must have been both magnificent and chaotic. Wooden scaffolding, earthen ramps for dragging materials upward, long lines of workers passing bricks hand to hand, ancient engineers measuring angles, levels, and layers, bricks stamped with the names of Untash Gal and the gods being placed into position like messages sent forward into time. And perhaps the king himself came often to watch, not only as the master of the work, but as a man seeing the physical form of the dream he had once carried only inside his mind. And here, we need to pause a little longer so we can really feel how bold the ziggurat was. Because in the world of Elam and Mesopotamia, a ziggurat was not simply a tall building. It was an artificial mountain. And to ancient people, a mountain was not merely a landscape feature. It was a symbol of nearness to the heavens, of a holier place. A place where the gods might descend and where human beings could offer up the very best of themselves. Khuzestan was a plain, broad and low, a land where the horizon usually opened flat and endless. Precisely because of that, to raise a tiered structure out of the earth like a mountain made by human hands was an act that was both architectural and theological. It said that if nature would not give us a mountain, we would build one for the gods ourselves. If the level earth laid too low beneath a sky too high, then we would stack fired brick into rising terraces to narrow that distance. It was a beautiful idea, a vast one, and also a reckless one, because only civilizations confident enough, or hungry enough, dare to raise such symbols in the middle of their own flat land. The first rising levels of the Ziggurat must have made a tremendous impression. Anyone passing through that region, farmer, craftsman, merchant, soldier, must have watched the monument growing day by day, as if watching a declaration becoming clearer and clearer. A declaration of the king's power and the god's presence. What had once been empty ground was becoming a mass that challenged the sun itself. What had once existed only in priestly words was now casting a long shadow across the plain. And from that point on, Chogha Zanbil was no longer an idea. It had begun to become part of the landscape. It had become a new horizon for Khuzestan. Something people could recognize from far away and know that they were approaching the dwelling place of the gods. But it was not height alone that gave the monument its power. There was also writing. In many ancient ziggurats and temples, inscribed bricks are speech made hard. At Chogha Zanbil, many bricks were stamped with the name of Untash Gal and dedicatory inscriptions. That matters deeply, because the king did not want only to build. He wanted to leave his voice embedded in the very layers of the monument. He wanted the future to know who had raised it, and for whom it had been raised. Each brick, then, was not merely a heavy object to be stacked. It was a fragment of text, a prayer, a signature of power, an effort to drive a human name into the body of architecture itself. So that even if everything someday collapsed, that voice might still remain hidden in broken fragments, waiting for people in a later age to kneel down and read. Night storytelling lets us feel details like that more deeply. Imagine a worker holding a still warm brick in his hands, looking at the signs freshly pressed into it, then passing it along the line. He cannot know the future. He does not know the monument will one day be abandoned. He does not know that thousands of years later other people will dig those bricks up and read those same marks to call Untash Gal's name back into the light. But in that moment, he is placing a piece of dynastic memory into the growing body of the Ziggurat. And because of moments like that, every great monument carries within it not only the ambition of kings, but also the anonymous labor of countless human beings whose names are never remembered. Day by day, Chogha Zanbil grew higher, broader, more defined. The multiple enclosure walls began to give shape to the sacred city. Gateways opened, secondary temples rose around the center. Areas for ritual, for priests, for the storage of offerings gradually took form. Space itself began to acquire its own order. It was no longer a random grouping of structures, but a world arranged to lead people from outside to inside, from ordinary life into holiness, from flat ground into height, from the noise of living into the sacred hush before the gods. This is something we often forget about ancient architecture. It was not built merely to stand. It was built to guide emotion, to guide footsteps, to guide the eye, to guide fear and faith in a certain direction. Chogha Zanbil, even while it was still under construction, must already have been conceived that way. Because when a person entered this sacred city, they were not merely passing through a gate. They were passing through an experience. From the outer wall to the courts. From the terraces to the central ziggurat. Everything seems designed to make a person feel they are leaving behind the world of dust. Markets. And harvests, and moving toward a place where the gods might truly listen. And because of that, as the monument continued to rise, the atmosphere around it must have changed as well. It was no longer just a worksite. It began to become a place that even laborers could no longer see as ordinary work. There may have been areas they entered more cautiously. There may have been sections only priests were allowed to touch. There may have been days when the sounds of hammers and hauling had to yield to ritual, to sacrifice, to prayer, as if to remind everyone that though it was all being made by human hands, its final purpose did not belong to humankind. And here again, the late hour gives us a special vantage point. Try to imagine the construction site of Chogha Zanbil not at noon, but at dusk, or just after night has begun to fall. The kilns are still burning red. Some groups of workers are finishing the last of the day's tasks. The shadow of the unfinished ziggurat already stretches long across the ground. In the distance, voices calling to one another have grown softer, more tired, and in the middle of the darkening plain, the parts of the structure already completed begin to appear like something no longer fully human. In moments like those, perhaps even the laborers began to feel that they were participating in something larger than labor itself. And perhaps it was nights like that that gave Chogha Zanbil a soul long before it was finished. As he watched the monument grow, Untash Gal must have felt the thing only those who dream on a vast enough scale ever get to taste. The sensation of seeing something that once existed only inside the mind begin stepping into the world. That feeling would have been pride, but also a quiet trembling, because once a dream takes visible form, it no longer belongs only to the dreamer. It begins having to face time, disaster, and the generations that come afterward. And perhaps deep down, the king understood that too. Every monumental structure is a wager against oblivion. It is raised to resist forgetting. But the larger it is, the more it invites time to test itself against it. Chogha Zanbil carried the seed of that struggle from the very beginning. It rose like a challenge. And precisely because it was a challenge, it would one day become all the more haunting when it was left behind. Still, at this stage, no one was thinking about abandonment. No one was imagining grass growing between broken bricks. No one was imagining centuries of silence. At this point, everything still belonged to a whole, unbroken faith. Faith that the sacred city would live, that the gods would protect it, that it would become the center of Elam, that Untash Gal's name would pass through time. This is what makes the story of Chogha Zanbil both beautiful and tragic. We know what they do not know. We stand on the far side of history and see the eventual end of their dream. But they are still in the beginning, while belief is still hot as a brick newly taken from the kiln. And if we want to understand the mystery of an abandoned monument, we must first respect the original faith that raised it. Perhaps that is why this part of the story should end not with the sound of hammers or the roar of kilns, but with a larger image. Imagine a morning when the first levels of the ziggurat have risen enough to be visible across the land. The sun climbs. Light touches the surfaces of the newly laid brick. People stand far away, in the fields or beside the river, lift their heads, and see that in the middle of the Khuzestan plain, a mountain made by human hands is rising. A mountain not born out of the earth the way a real mountain is, but born out of will, labor, ritual, and the desire to reach the gods. In that moment, Chogha Zanbil is no longer a construction site. It has already become a symbol. And from that very moment, its mystery begins to live. Because every great symbol eventually has to answer the question time always asks: can the thing built to be immortal truly defeat oblivion? And because that question has already begun to glow quietly beneath the story, what comes next will no longer be only the story of construction. It will be the story of Chogha Zanbil entering its brightest age. When the sacred city is no longer a promise or an unfinished work, but a fully living holy center, where incense smoke, prayer, the footsteps of priests, and the felt nearness of the gods all seem to dwell beneath the burning sky of Khuzestan. And once a structure is no longer merely a building site, once the bricks have stopped being materials and begun to become the visible form of belief, once the ziggurat can already be seen from far away lifting above the plain like an artificial mountain in the middle of Khuzestan, then it has entered the most radiant chapter of its short but glorious life. Because from that point on, what Untash Gal once saw only in his mind is no longer a vision taking shape. It is a world, a sacred center, a place where human footsteps must slow, where voices must lower, and where even the eye itself is drawn upward, as though the architecture forces the heart to remember that it is standing before something beyond ordinary life. And perhaps only in this phase did Chogha Zanbil fully become what it had been born to be, the greatest ziggurat still surviving in Iran. The sacred heart of a holy city in the Elamite plain. If we imagine Chogha Zanbil in that age of splendor, the first thing that appears is not the dry ruin we know today, but wholeness, a wholeness so complete it would have been overwhelming. Multiple layers of surrounding walls, gateways opening into sacred space, smaller shrines arranged around the central mass, broad courts where the feet of pilgrims, priests, and officials once passed, and in the center of it all, rising like the axis of the whole city, stood the ziggurat itself, tier upon tier, solemn, massive, shining beneath the Khuzestan sun as though the sunlight lingered longer on its brick faces than anywhere else. We do not know exactly what every original surface color looked like, but it is easy to imagine newer brick, fresh plaster, and decorative details not yet worn away by wind and time, giving the whole structure a presence that was both solid and almost unreal. Perhaps if you had stood far away on a clear morning, you would have seen that ziggurat rising like a mountain carved out of sheer will. And that is what made Chogha Zanbil feel so different. It did not look like houses. It did not look like palaces. It did not look like a fortification. It was not built primarily to keep rain and sun off human beings, nor for an army to defend itself within. It was built to be seen, to be felt, to make anyone standing before it understand at once that they had entered a region where earth and sky had been joined by human hands. The high terraces, the stacked levels, the vast wall surfaces do not allow the eye to glide across them carelessly. They force it upward. And when the eye goes upward, the heart follows. That is one of the greatest powers of sacred architecture. Without saying anything, it can still lead the human mind where it wants it to go. And perhaps because of that, Chogha Zanbil when it was alive was not only a structure. It was an experience, A person entering it was not simply approaching a tower. They were passing through layers of space, through gateways, through courts, through subsidiary shrines, through distances carefully arranged to slow their pace and shift them from the ordinary world into the sacred one. A holy city is not made of brick alone. It is made of rhythm, the rhythm of footsteps, the rhythm of distance, the rhythm of moving deeper and finding that you belong less and less to the outside world. And at Chogha Zanbil, that rhythm must have been very clear. A person crossing the outer enclosure might still feel part of ordinary life. But the closer they came to the ziggurat, the more they climbed, or the more they were forced to look upward, the more they were drawn into another atmosphere, one in which the gods felt nearer. In the late night quiet, it becomes easy to picture great ceremonial mornings there. The sun has not yet reached its full force. The air still holds that rare brief gentleness before the heat begins to descend over the plain. From many directions, people move toward the sacred city. Perhaps common people carrying offerings. Perhaps nobles in escorted groups. Perhaps priests in ritual dress. Slow and solemn, leading the ceremonies of the day. Maybe incense smoke is already rising early. Maybe ancient Elamite prayers are already being chanted. There is the sound of feet on packed ground, the clink of carried objects, the cry of sacrificial animals in fear, and all of those sounds, upon nearing the ziggurat, seem to grow quieter, not because anyone commands silence, but because the architecture itself creates the feeling that ordinary speech no longer belongs there. Because the greatest power of Chogha Zanbil in its complete state was not only its size, but its ability to make those who entered it feel smaller. This is a very old kind of power. Ancient civilizations understood that if they wanted people to remember the gods, they had to make them feel the difference between themselves and the sacred. A field cannot do that. An ordinary house cannot do it either. But a ziggurat rising above the plain, vast, tiered, enclosed within walls and ritual space, can. It makes people remember that they are only one small part of a larger order. And at the same time, it makes them remember that the king himself, Untash Gao, was the one who had built the bridge between them and that order. In other words, the monument honored the gods, but it also honored royal power in a deeper way than any public proclamation ever could. The more one thinks about it, the easier it becomes to understand why the ancient world gave so much to Chogha Zanbil. Not merely to display wealth, not merely to beautify the land, but to create a sacred center powerful enough to organize both the spiritual and political life of the kingdom. A place where people, in looking upward, would not see only a monument, but a condensed model of the universe. Heaven above, the gods nearer to heaven, the king as mediator, the priests as guardians of ritual, the people entering with reverence and fear. It was a worldview built in brick, and that made Chogha Zanbil great not only in material scale, but in meaning. But geometry and mass alone are not enough to make a holy city truly live. A place like that must also have its own rhythm of daily life. A rhythm we can now recover only through imagination. Around the ziggurat, there were likely rooms for storing offerings. Smaller shrines devoted to different gods. Places where priests prepared rituals. Spaces for valuables. Quarters for those who served the sacred. Corridors where footsteps never ceased. A center like that could not have been a mute body of brick. It had to have life. It had to have incense. It had to have chanting. It had to have water for purification rites. It had to have the footsteps of those who served the unseen. And once we imagine it as living in that way, only then can we begin to feel how terrible its later silence must have been. But that silence belongs to centuries still ahead. For now, Chogha Zanbil is still in the light. Ritual is still being performed. The walls are still strong. The terraces are not yet eaten away by sun and wind. The inscribed bricks still rest in place. The dedicatory prayers to the gods are still being spoken as though the gods are truly listening from somewhere above. Offerings may have been brought here in abundance. Great rites tied to the agricultural cycle, to victory, to royal occasions may all have converged here as the spiritual heart of the dynasty. And perhaps in such moments Untash Gal felt that he had become more than the ruler of Elam. He had succeeded in making his dream the center of the kingdom. That leads me to think about how a king must feel when he stands before a work that has finally been completed. Not when it is still a plan in his mind. Not when the site is still full of dust and labor. But when everything has taken its place, become symbolic, and begun to function like a living thing. Perhaps Untash Gal had moments like that, standing at a vantage point high enough or far enough to see all of Chogha Zanbil in the evening light. The enclosing walls, the shrines, the ziggurat rising from the center like a mountain carrying both his name and the names of the gods at once. In moments like that, perhaps he truly believed he had defeated oblivion. That even though human life was short, this monument would preserve his name. That even if the dynasty changed, this place would remain, a brick heart of Elam. That faith makes Chogha Zanbil's bright age all the more beautiful. Because we know what the builders did not know. Time is always more patient than human belief. But before we speak of time's betrayal, we should remain a little longer with this splendor. Because only wholeness makes later ruin hurt. Imagine the brick surfaces still unbroken, the edges still sharp, the pathways not yet swallowed by the earth, the stairways still intact for those who climbed toward the higher sacred levels, the subsidiary shrines still having doors, roofs, altars, offerings, perhaps objects of metal and stone reflecting torchlight at night. Picture this holy city on the night of a great festival, when fires are lit in the courts, incense smoke rises in thin drifting bands, and the ziggurat stands black and immense beneath a sky full of stars. In such moments, the people present may have truly believed that the gods were very near. That this place had not been built merely for human eyes, but so that the invisible realm might bend a little closer. And if there really were nights like that, then Chogha Zanbil was not merely architecture. It was one of the highest expressions of sacred imagination in the Elamite world. And it is at exactly that point that something else becomes clear. Chogha Zanbil was not only a religious symbol. It was also the greatest political symbol Untash Gal could raise. A monument like that told the surrounding lands, allies, rivals, and subjects alike that Elam was not just one kingdom among many. Elam had its own sacred center, its own gods, power great enough to gather resources, labor, and faith into a structure that, by sight alone, declared that this was a civilization fully serious about its own existence. In the ancient world, the sacred was political at the deepest level. Whoever could build a dwelling place for the gods could also build the foundation of his own authority. Untash Gal surely understood that. But the larger the symbol, the more it invites the question time eventually asks all such things. Will you stand forever? And because Chogha Zanbil once lived so brightly, stood so centrally, bore so much faith, so much ritual, so much Elamite ambition, its later abandonment would become even more haunting. Because when something built to be the heart falls silent, it leaves behind a deeper emptiness than an ordinary structure ever could. Yet that belongs to the darkness still ahead. At this moment, the ziggurat is whole, the sacred city is still breathing, the walls still hold the sound of footsteps, the temples still hold smoke, and the Elamite world still believes it has raised a place holy enough to draw the gods nearer to humankind. Perhaps that is why the more time we spend inside this radiant phase, the more we understand that Chogha Zanbil's beauty lies not only in its form, but in the faith it once contained. Ancient civilizations may not have left us all their voices, but they did leave the shape of their faith in brick and stone. And in the case of Chogha Zanbil, that faith was so immense that it required an entire city to hold it, an entire man-made mountain to bear it, an entire network of ritual to keep it alive. That tells us the Elamites did not approach their gods timidly. They approached with the full weight of their lives. And that is what makes this ruin worthy not only of excavation, but of listening, of sitting beside, the way we are sitting beside it tonight. And because we have gone deeply enough into that radiant age, what waits ahead will feel all the sadder and more mysterious. Because once the sacred city truly lived, once the ziggurat had stood as a mountain of faith and power, the question was no longer how it was built, but what began to crack within the world that built it. What caused a place once filled with incense, ritual, prayer, footsteps, and belief to move slowly toward silence? And why did a monument born to resist forgetting end up abandoned in the Khuzestan plain, left to wind and dust for thousands of years? It is precisely from the brightest light of Chogha Zanbil that the true darkness of its story first begins to show. And from the moment that darkness begins to show behind all that brilliance, Chogha Zanbil enters the deepest part of its life. It is no longer only a great monument or a sacred center of political power, but a world unto itself. A place sustained by ritual, by incense, by repeated acts of faith, where people did not come merely to look, but to tremble, to ask, to offer, to believe that somewhere in this burning land the gods were truly listening. Because a ziggurat, no matter how tall, if it stood there only as brick and stone, would still not be the heart of a sacred city. That heart had to beat. It had to have rhythm. It had to have sound, scent, flame, spoken prayer, and mysteries not everyone who entered could fully know. And perhaps it is at this depth that Chogha Zanbil became the thing that would later haunt the imagination. Not only because it was once great, but because it once lived through a sacred life so dense that even after everything had gone cold, the echo of it still lingered like smoke in a temple gone dark for thousands of years. Try to imagine a great festival day there, not from the perspective of the king or the high priest, but through the eyes of an ordinary person walking in through the city gate. Even from the outside, that person must have felt the air was different, not only because of the massive walls, not only because the ziggurat rose at the center, but because everything around it seemed arranged to a rhythm unlike life out among the fields. The scent of fragrant resins and incense drifted upward in thin streams. The sounds of footsteps, calls, and preparations moved through the air, but never with the noise of a marketplace. Even sound itself seemed to know it had to lower its voice there. In the courts there may have been lines of people bringing offerings, ceramic jars, grain, oil, cloth, animals, or more precious objects meant for the gods. Priests moved through the space in their ritual garments, carrying about them an air that made others instinctively lower their eyes. And above all of it, the ziggurat remained silent and immense, like a mountain watching everything without speaking. Perhaps it was that mixture of movement and stillness that made the ceremonial world of Chogha Zanbil so powerful in its own frightening way. Because to the ancient imagination, the gods were never purely gentle beings. Yes, they gave harvests, but they could also take them away. They protected cities, but they could also punish if ritual failed, if the king lost divine favor, if order broke down. So every act of worship carried two things at once: reverence and fear. People did not offer sacrifice only out of gratitude. They offered it also to avert disaster, to keep the world from slipping out of its proper rhythm, to make sure the river still flowed, the crops still rose, sickness did not spread, war did not sweep them off the land. Chogha Zanbil, as Elam's sacred center, must have gathered all of that into itself. Every ritual there was not only symbolic, it carried the weight of survival. If we let the imagination go deeper into the night, we can see that ritual life at Chogha Zanbil was not simply a gathering that began and ended. It was a rhythm of existence. There were seasonal rites, rites tied to planting and harvest, rites for different gods, offerings made after victories, in times of sickness, in drought, in childbirth. Perhaps there were rites reserved for the royal house itself, in which the king or his representative entered not as an ordinary worshipper, but as the living bridge between the kingdom and the unseen powers. In those moments, Chogha Zanbil ceased to be a place built by human beings for the gods. It became the place where the gods were felt to be present through the order of ritual. The repeated sound of sacred language, the smell of smoke, the form of the offering, the sudden silence when the rite entered its holiest moment. And it is here that the first deeper shadow of mystery begins to gather. Because every great sacred center has spaces not everyone may enter. There are courts where many may stand. There are places only temple servants may approach. And there are still deeper zones, where the gods are believed to be nearest, where only high-ranking priests or the chosen few may go. Chogha Zanbil must have been like that too. A holy city sustained by ritual cannot reveal itself completely to every eye. It needs its secrets. It needs layers of space that preserve the feeling that some part of the divine does not belong entirely to humankind. Perhaps that is why, for ordinary people, Chogha Zanbil was not only a place they came to. It was also a place they could never fully know. And that very incompleteness made their reverence even deeper. Picture a night ceremony under torchlight. The sun is gone, though the ground still releases the day's heat. Fires burn along the steps and courtyards. Incense twists upward through the darkness. Priests chant in sacred language, with a rhythm that may have sounded halfway between song and spell. Footsteps slow, noise diminishes, offerings are brought forward, Perhaps blood was spilled there once, falling on the brick as a material covenant between humans and the divine. Perhaps jars of oil were poured out. Perhaps bread, wine, incense, grain, and precious objects were set in their appointed places. In such a setting, the firelight does not merely illuminate the ziggurat. It makes it seem more alive, more fearsome, as though the darkness all around it has been arranged so that the gods may draw near without revealing themselves. People who have never lived inside an ancient world sometimes forget that ritual is not merely performance. It is a device for organizing fear. When human beings face a universe too large and too difficult to understand, they need repeated patterns in order to feel that they are not entirely helpless. Ritual offers them the assurance, or at least the hope, that the world can be calmed, negotiated with, held in order, if the right thing is offered, the right words are spoken, the right path is walked, the right place is stood in. Chogha Zanbil was a machine for organizing fear and faith in precisely that sense. It guided human emotion through layers of space, ritual, and symbol until people could believe that they had truly touched the sacred. And that is why it became so powerful. Without ritual, the ziggurat is only architecture. With ritual, it becomes a miniature universe. Among the gods worshipped there, some probably received their own portions of sacred space in the lesser shrines around the central mass, while the ziggurat itself remained the highest, holiest place, the point toward which every line of sight, every footstep, every sequence of ritual ultimately converged. People did not always need to climb higher to feel the gods more closely. The mere presence of the ziggurat was enough to give everything around it a different gravity. It was the center, the spine, the artificial mountain that made everything else meaningful. And because of that, the ritual life of Chogha Zanbil was almost certainly never spontaneous. It was ordered, repeated, guarded, and preserved by the collective memory of the priests as a kind of powerful knowledge. Whoever knew the proper ritual possessed the key to the sacred zone. Whoever kept the prayers, the sequence, the dates, the gestures, kept the holy city alive. That is why the atmosphere of Chogha Zanbil must always have existed on two levels at once. One level was the outward movement, people arriving, offerings being carried in, sacrificial goods being prepared, footsteps, calls, preparations that never really stopped. But beneath that was another level, an immense stillness, the stillness of order, the stillness of things that could not be done incorrectly. The stillness born of the belief that if anything in this place fell out of rhythm, the consequence would not merely be embarrassment or disorder, but calamity for the whole land. That kind of stillness often makes people tremble more than shouting ever could. And perhaps in the deepest pauses between ceremonies, Chogha Zanbil was exactly that kind of place. A place where no one needed to speak loudly about the gods. Because every brick, every stair, every thread of smoke already reminded people that they stood inside the realm of the sacred. Think of the priests there, men whose names history has mostly forgotten, yet who were the true keepers of the city's living rhythm. They knew which words could not be spoken wrongly. They knew when the fires must be lit, which offerings belonged to which god, when ordinary worshippers could stand near, and when they had to withdraw, which parts of the ziggurat might be touched, and which only looked upon. They held not just the architectural map of Chogha Zanbil, but its sacred map. A center like that could not stand by the will of the king alone. It had to be kept alive by people who knew how to turn royal intention into a durable rhythm repeated day after day, season after season, year after year. And that is why, when we speak of the mystery of Chogha Zanbil, we are not speaking only of silent bricks. We are also speaking of a dense priestly life that once flowed through it like blood through a body. Perhaps around this sacred city there also grew stories ordinary people heard only in whispers, stories of omens, signs, dreams, times when the gods had spoken through a priest or a ritual. Every great religious center produces its own internal mythology. Such stories may never be inscribed, never enter formal history, and yet they nourish that softer kind of fear that makes people bow before a holy place. People may have told one another that a divine sign had once appeared there, that a certain prayer had once been answered, that anyone who profaned the place would not remain unpunished. Whether true or not, such stories are part of power. And Chogha Zanbil, by its sheer scale and position, must have lived inside an atmosphere full of such murmurs. The more one dwells on this part of the story, the more one understands why Chogha Zanbil's later silence feels so devastating. Because what once lived there was not only human activity, it was the rhythm of belief. Once the prayers stopped, once the smoke no longer rose, once the priests no longer chanted, once ritual footsteps no longer wore the courtyards smooth, the place did not merely lose its population. It lost the animating soul of what it had been. But during this age of splendor, no one imagined that. People must have believed that if the gods had truly taken up residence there, if the king had truly dedicated the place, if the rites were kept correctly, then Chogha Zanbil would stand and live for a very long time. And perhaps that very certainty makes the darkness that comes later all the more painful. Because decline is cruelest when it comes to places most convinced of their endurance. Still, before that darkness fully arrives, we ought to pause once more and see Chogha Zanbil as its own people once saw it. Not as archaeologists, not as modern visitors, but as Elamites entering the holiest center they knew. It was the place where the gods could draw very near, the place where the king had condensed his power into brick, the place where people brought their harvest, their fear, their hope, and their helplessness and laid them down, the place where earth and heaven seemed bound together by ritual order. A place like that, if it truly lived, gave meaning to every sound, every smell, every flame. And when a place so full of meaning becomes a ruin, what disappears is never only architecture. And it is precisely from that fullness of meaning that the shadow of the first great question becomes clearer. What could make a sacred center on that scale slowly lose its life? Was it war from outside? Weakening from within? Changes in power? Shifts in religious life? Or simply time, the slowest and most patient enemy of all, beginning its work from the inside before anyone fully noticed? The answer still lies ahead. But even now, while Chogha Zanbil is still bright, still filled with smoke, still ringing with prayer, we can already feel something profoundly human. Everything built to resist oblivion carries the fear of oblivion within it from the very beginning. And perhaps that invisible fear was the first true shadow standing behind this sacred city. And from that invisible shadow, from the fear of being forgotten that already stood behind walls still whole and prayers still warm. The story of Chogha Zanbil leads us into another layer, one where we no longer see only ritual, no longer only smell incense or hear prayers, but begin to understand more clearly the full weight of power, wealth, and belief that once held this monument upright in the middle of the Khuzestan plain. Because no sacred city on that scale rises by faith alone. Faith may light the flame, but to turn that flame into brick, wall, wide courts, terraces, and ceremonies repeated over years and decades, wealth is required, order is required, a network of power is required, and a kingdom stable enough to feed the dream with grain, labor, material, and continuity. And so, if we want to understand the mystery of Chogha Zanbil deeply, we have to look at how strong Elam once was, how wealthy it once was, and how deeply it once believed in itself. Try looking at that land once again, but this time not through the eyes of a pilgrim entering a holy center, but through the eyes of someone standing high enough and far enough away to see all of Khuzestan spread out like a woven fabric of life. Rivers flashing in the sun, fields sustained by silt, roads linking settlements, caravans of goods moving in and out, grain stores, landing places where produce was exchanged. And in the middle of that whole network, Chogha Zanbil was not standing alone like a solitary dream. It was being fed by a much larger material foundation. A ziggurat cannot survive on belief if belief has nothing to eat. A sacred city cannot sustain its rituals if the storehouses are empty. If the roads are broken, if craftsmen are no longer supported, if the court no longer has the power to protect the flows of life that nourish the monument. Which means that the glory of Chogha Zanbil is itself proof that Elam, at that moment, was not weak. It was strong enough to channel resources into something that went far beyond immediate survival. That matters enormously, because only societies that have reached a certain level of organization and surplus can begin building monuments whose meaning exceeds daily life. When people are still fighting for each meal, each flood, each season of scarcity, they rarely pour the strength of an entire region into a vast sacred city. That means that behind Chogha Zanbil stood an Elam capable of gathering labor, wealth, and collective will around a shared monument. Untash Gal's power at the time must have been strong enough to issue commands and see them carried out. The network of cities, agriculture, and trade in the region must have been functioning well enough to support the project. The priesthood and nobility must either have supported it or been brought under its authority. And most importantly, there must have existed within Elam a confidence large enough for them to believe they were not merely surviving alongside larger powers, but capable of creating a sacred center on their own terms. The more we think that way, the more clearly we see that Chogha Zanbil was not just a monument of religious fear, but also a declaration by a kingdom about its own worth. A declaration spoken not through diplomacy or conquest, but through fired brick and sacred space. It said that Elam was rich enough to build, powerful enough to mobilize, confident enough to imagine itself entitled to lay a model of the cosmos down upon the earth, spiritually serious enough to dedicate a whole sacred center to the gods. In that sense, wealth and belief fused into one another there. Material resources gave the monument its body, faith gave it its soul, and power stood between them. binding the two into one thing. Perhaps if one had entered Chogha Zanbil during its greatest age, one would have felt that wealth not only in visible display, but in the city's sheer ability to maintain order. A sacred place kept clean, always furnished with offerings, always attended by priests, always stocked with the proper ritual objects, always carrying smoke, firelight, and the repeated rhythm of sacred life. That is already a sign of strength. Because for all of that to continue without interruption, there must be overseers, distribution networks, reserves, craftsmen, repairers, scribes, and authorities strong enough to ensure that none of those resources fail. In other words, Chogha Zanbil was not merely built through wealth. It was sustained by a deeper kind of wealth, organizational power. And that kind of power is one of the clearest signs that a kingdom still believes in the stability of its own existence. If we sit quietly with that thought a little longer tonight, we can imagine processions of offerings brought there, not just incense and symbolic gifts, but oil, grain, wine, livestock, textiles, precious materials, and the best things of daily life. Each of those offerings mattered not just as a gift to the gods, but as proof that the kingdom had enough abundance to surrender a meaningful part of itself to the unseen without collapsing. That is a particular kind of luxury in the ancient world. Luxury not for self-adornment, but to prove that one can still give the best portion to the divine. And it is here that we feel most clearly how Elam's wealth and faith once upheld each other. People believed because they had, and they had, in part, because they believed the gods stood behind that abundance. Yet it is precisely in that deep bond between resources and holiness, between storehouses and incense, between royal power and ritual order, that the seed of fragility had already been planted. Because the more a monument depends upon the overall health of the kingdom that sustains it, the more quickly it will feel the cracks when that kingdom begins to weaken. At the height of splendor, almost no one sees that. Everything appears as though it will last. The walls still stand, the offerings still arrive, the priests are still numerous, the rivers still feed the fields. The king is still strong. But history rarely announces the exact moment when foundations begin to tire. It does not roar at first. More often it only breathes a little differently. A road becomes less safe. One stretch of land yields a poorer harvest. A conflict within the court becomes harder to calm. A campaign costs more men and grain than expected. Somewhere, belief itself begins to thin, though no one yet has a word for that thinning. And only later, looking back, do people realize the earliest signs were already there. But in this age of greatness, no one is looking back. They are still living inside the center of their own belief. Untash Gal likely did not think of himself as building a future ruin. He believed he was raising something that would keep both his name and his kingdom standing beyond the span of human life. The people did not imagine walls later to be gnawed by wind, buried by sand, and split by grass. They saw the gods there. They saw order there. They saw that Elam had a heart that other lands would have to look toward. And perhaps that is what makes Chogha Zanbil sadder than many other ancient monuments. It was not born out of temporary thinking. It was born out of a very real confidence in permanence. If we follow that thought even further, we begin to see that Chogha Zanbil also symbolizes something profoundly human. The desire to give the success of one era a form large enough to remain visible afterward. The richest, strongest, most inwardly coherent civilizations do not merely accumulate wealth. They want to crystallize it. They want to raise it into a shape that time itself has to confront. The pyramids of Egypt, the temples of Mesopotamia, the palaces and walls of many lands, all of them are attempts of that kind. Chogha Zanbil, within the Elamite world, was one of the grandest. It said, "We were here. We were strong. We believed. We knew how to organize the world around our gods." And perhaps, at the deepest level, every civilization raising a monument of that scale is trying to write that sentence into the earth. But there is a sorrowful paradox that time always waits to prove. The more something is built to resist forgetting, the more it makes later generations tremble when it is finally forgotten. Chogha Zanbil would one day become exactly that kind of example. But here, in this part of the story, we are still allowed to remain inside the light, to stay with the years when Elam was strong enough to dream on that scale. To stay with the years when Khuzestan could nourish both its fields and its sacred monument. To stay with the years when king, priest, and people still looked together toward the Ziggurat as if it were the material guarantee of order itself. To stay with the time when ritual still had no idea it would one day fall silent. And perhaps that staying is necessary. Because to understand the haunting power of an abandoned place, we must first understand how deeply it was once trusted. The later it gets in the night, the more clearly that truth appears. The wealth of Chogha Zanbil was not only material. It was also a wealth of meaning. Many places may have had more resources, more soldiers, more land, but not every place could gather so many layers of belief into a single architectural form. This is the kind of wealth money alone cannot buy if a society does not believe in itself deeply enough. And that is exactly what set Chogha Zanbil apart from ordinary ancient monuments. It was not only the trace of a powerful era. It was the trace of an era that believed itself worthy of having its own sacred center between heaven and earth. Perhaps Untash Gal, in the brightest years of his life, looked at Chogha Zanbil as if it were the materialized soul of his dynasty. Not only an offering to the gods, but proof that Elam did not live quietly on the edge of the world. It had a voice, it had ritual, it had divinity, it had enough power to condense belief into architecture. And when a king reaches that feeling, it becomes almost impossible for him to imagine that the very monument he regards as a heart could one day become nothing but wind and silence. And precisely because he could not imagine that, the mystery hurts more when it comes. And from the brilliance of this high age, the story already begins to take on a quiet sorrow. A very thin sadness like the shadow beginning at the edge of afternoon. Because no kingdom is ever entirely motionless. No faith sustains itself forever without renewal. No order remains untouched if beneath it the currents of power, economy, war, and devotion begin to shift. Chogha Zanbil was once that great, fed by so much wealth, so much belief, so much authority, that when something eventually began to shake, it would not be a mere crack in a wall. It would be a crack running through the heart of a whole world. And that is exactly what the next part of the story will begin to reveal. When amid all that wealth, power, and faith, the first signs of decline appear like tiny fractures in the night. fractures no one is yet willing to admit are there. And it is from those tiny fractures, from movements so subtle that the people living then may not even have had words for them, that the story of Chogha Zanbil enters the most frightening phase of any great dream. The moment when everything still appears intact: walls, courts, incense, ritual, people moving beneath the shadow of the ziggurat, and yet somewhere underneath that wholeness, decline has already begun to breathe. Collapse does not always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it arrives like the faint fraying of a rope that has not yet snapped. Like a river beginning to change course before anyone standing on the bank can see it. And if anything makes the story of Chogha Zanbil sadder than the ruin that comes later, it is perhaps this stage above all, the stage when everything still seems alive. But the seed of silence has already been sown. Try to imagine a sacred city like Chogha Zanbil at a moment when order still seems intact on the outside. But the rhythms within are no longer quite what they once were. The offerings may still be arriving in numbers large enough to hide the change. The priests may still be reciting the proper prayers, still burning incense, still leading ritual processions through the courtyards as they have for years. The ziggurat may still be glowing under the sun and the torches may still be lit at night. But little by little, the most perceptive people, the ones who live by the instincts of power and ritual, must have begun to feel that something was no longer as solid as before. A caravan arrives late. A storehouse is not as full as it usually is. A major festival is quietly reduced in scale, though no one says so out loud. The face of the man in charge of distribution looks more strained than usual. A conversation is cut short when someone approaches. Taken one by one, such signs may mean very little. But history often begins slipping off its course through exactly such small things. Khuzestan, though fed by river water, was never a land where people could sleep easily. Harvests depended on the rhythm of the water. Prosperity depended on canals, fields, storage systems, and roads all continuing to work the way they should. A kingdom that wanted to keep supporting a monumental sacred center like Chogha Zanbil had to keep many moving parts stable all at once. Let just one of those parts drift out of place, and the whole body of power would begin to tire. Perhaps there were years when the waters no longer behaved as gently as before. Perhaps shifts in trade, or conflict with surrounding regions, made the flow of wealth supporting the sacred city less reliable. Perhaps, within the Elamite court itself, the rulers who came after Untash Gal no longer carried the same intensity of belief, or the same ability to organize. A monument like Chogha Zanbil did not only need to be built, it needed to be loved with the same force the founder had loved it. And history shows again and again that such devotion rarely remains intact across generations. This may be where we need to confront the fragility of every great symbol. The stronger the symbol, the more deeply it depends on the world around it still wanting to sustain it. When Untash Gal was alive, when his power was concentrated, when faith and wealth still flowed in the same direction, Chogha Zanbil could stand at the center as a sacred heart no one doubted. But what happens if the ruler who comes next no longer shares the same dream? If he cares more about war than ritual? If he needs the kingdom's wealth for other purposes? If he no longer wishes to pour strength into a sacred city beyond Susa with the same intensity as the man before him? Then decline will not arrive with the crash of hammers tearing down a temple. It will come through the thinning of priority. Through the moment when what was once the heart becomes merely something to be maintained. More or less. And for a monument born out of total belief, like Chogha Zanbil, the cooling of that belief may have been more dangerous than any enemy. In the stillness of night, if we listen carefully, we can feel the sorrow of this stage exactly there, not in the spectacle of grand destruction, but in the fact that there may have been a long stretch of time when Chogha Zanbil still looked whole enough for people to assume everything would be fine. While the truth was already slipping away, the rituals may still have continued, but more from momentum than conviction. The priests may still have been there, but perhaps understood better than anyone else that the weight of this sacred center was changing. The walls may still have stood, but a crack might have taken longer to repair. A replastered section may have been done a little less carefully. A room may have remained closed longer between festival seasons. Such things rarely make it into formal chronicles, but they are often decline in its truest form. Not the collapse itself, but the slow withdrawal of life from a body whose outward shape still remains. You can imagine an aging priest who had spent his whole life at Chogha Zanbil. He had known it in brighter years, in more crowded years, in fuller festivals, and then, year after year, he began to see small things changing, familiar faces disappearing, younger generations no longer carrying the old fear in quite the same way. Offerings arriving in thinner streams. Certain rituals simplified. Certain sacred spaces visited less often. To an outsider, those things might mean nothing. But to the man who kept the sacred rhythm, they would have sounded like clear fractures. He may have known, long before anyone else would admit it, that the city had crossed a threshold, that it was no longer in its age of expansion, but in an age of holding its shape while the life within it began flowing elsewhere. And it was not only ritual that was changing. Political power must have been changing too. A monument like Chogha Zanbil could survive only because it stood inside a kind of balance. One in which the king needed the gods, and the gods needed the king to serve as their patron through architecture, offerings, and order. But if the Elamite court entered a period of instability, if war on the frontiers grew more intense, if outlying territories became harder to control, if the throne itself became less secure, then one of the first things to feel the strain may have been the great sacred monuments, because they depended on too much support flowing down from above. A small local temple could survive on the life of the surrounding village. But a sacred city on the scale of Chogha Zanbil needed an entire kingdom still willing to keep its fire alive. Let that willingness weaken, and the city would begin to feel the cold. Perhaps from here on, the first real thoughts of unease began to rise among those in power. Not necessarily spoken aloud, but perhaps they began looking at one another through longer silences. Some decisions were postponed. Some repairs were not carried out immediately. Some festivals were no longer held with the fullness tradition demanded. And because places like Chogha Zanbil live by the steady repetition of ritual, even a slight disturbance in that cycle would begin to throw the whole sacred body out of rhythm. Like a heart that has not yet stopped, but no longer beats as it once did. This is the part of the story people miss if they do not stay with it long enough. But this is the part that makes the later ruin hurt. Because destruction does not begin when the bricks start falling. It begins when the will to keep the bricks intact begins to fade. If we keep going deeper into this first darkness, we find something else profoundly human. Great communities rarely accept the decline of their symbols right away. They go on behaving as though everything is still fine, even when somewhere deep inside they already know it is not. Chogha Zanbil may have gone through exactly such a stage. The rituals still held, the gates still opened, the priests still appeared in full ceremonial dress. But behind all of it, perhaps there was an inward tightening, a knowledge that no one named aloud, a fear that if people admitted something had changed, the authority of the sacred city would crack even faster. Because a holy symbol always lives on collective belief. Once the community begins looking at it with doubt, it has already lost part of its power. So perhaps for many years Chogha Zanbil continued living by ritual, but also by the quiet denial of those who still wanted to believe it was as strong as before. But history is rarely merciful to places living on momentum alone, and that is why this part of the story grows colder and colder. Because now we are no longer looking at Chogha Zanbil as a blazing summit, but as a great lamp beginning to run out of oil. The flame is still there. The light still shines far enough to be seen from a distance. But if you come closer, if you pay attention, you realize the color of the flame has changed. Its steadiness has changed. The dark pauses between the brighter moments have grown longer. A sacred center that lives by incense and prayer reveals that kind of fragility more quickly than almost any other place. Because the more a place depends on the repetition of sacred rhythm, the more clearly the emptiness begins to show when that rhythm breaks. Perhaps at this stage, Chogha Zanbil still did not know its final fate. The monument did not know it would be abandoned. The people did not yet imagine wind moving through empty courtyards, grass growing between broken bricks, the ziggurat standing beneath the sun without a single prayer being spoken. But that is exactly what makes this part so painful. Because we know. We sit thousands of years later and can see that those little fractures, in ritual, in power, in wealth, in belief, will eventually accumulate like wind-blown dust until no one is left with enough strength to keep this center in its old form. But the people living through that time could only feel it through intuition, through tiredness they could not explain, through a kind of cold mist inside the soul that had not yet become language. And perhaps that is why this part of the story should not end with collapse, but with a feeling. The feeling that Chogha Zanbil is still standing there, still with its ziggurat, its temples, its walls, its people moving through it, its incense, its order, but that deep under the brick, beneath the feet of priests and beneath the repeated prayers, something has already begun to leave. No one may yet be able to see it, but one day people will understand that this was the first moment when the sacred city began walking toward silence. And from that moment onward, the story moves into something even sadder still. The part where Chogha Zanbil no longer only cracks from within, but is gradually pushed by time, by history, and perhaps by the hands of war themselves completely out of the living world and into abandonment amid the red dust and hot wind of Khuzestan. And from those first tiny fractures, from those vague changes that feel like the earliest cold breath of a coming season before anyone dares to name it, Chogha Zanbil began entering the saddest chapter of its life, the chapter in which a place built so that the gods might dwell there, so that power might be sanctified there, so that an entire civilization might pour its greatest dream into it. Slowly had to learn how to live with absence. Not absence arriving all at once. Not through one single event. One fire. One curse. One storm tearing everything apart. No, the abandonment of places like that rarely comes with noise. It comes the way breath slowly leaves a great body. First one rhythm fades. Then one sound. Then one courtyard is no longer crossed. One corridor is closed a little earlier. One subsidiary shrine is visited less often. One ritual is simplified. One storehouse is no longer filled as before. And then one day, though no one can point to the exact moment, people look around and realize the sacred city is no longer alive. It is still standing, but it is no longer alive. Try to picture a morning there in that stage. The sunlight still rises as always. The walls still catch the light. The ziggurat still casts its long shadow. The wind still moves over the Khuzestan plain carrying the smell of earth, dry grass, and distant river air, but the atmosphere has changed. The invisible fullness that once belonged to a place sustained by shared belief is gone. The sense that everything is held taut by the nearness of the sacred is gone. There may still be a few attendants. There may still be a small circle of priests trying to preserve the rites. A few doors may still open, but the empty spaces have already begun to speak. And emptiness, when it appears in a place that was once too full, is always more frightening than noise. It makes every footstep louder, every room wider, every wall colder, every prayer, if any are still being spoken, feel as though the space itself is swallowing part of its force. No one knows precisely all the reasons Chogha Zanbil was pulled toward desolation. Perhaps the center of Elamite power shifted. Perhaps the generations after Untash Gal no longer had the conviction or the resources to keep supporting it with the same intensity. Perhaps war from beyond Elam, changing relations with Mesopotamian powers, changes in trade, agriculture, or political structure all contributed to its decline. And perhaps, as so often happens in history, there was not one cause but many streams of weakness flowing together. Slowly but steadily, until what had once stood at the center no longer held its place there. But whatever the cause, one thing is certain. Chogha Zanbil passed through a long interval in which it moved from living to empty. From sound to hush. From ritual to momentum. From momentum to abandonment. Perhaps the earliest stage of abandonment did not look like abandonment at all. People may still have come, just in smaller numbers. Priests may still have spoken the prayers, only more quietly. Some major ceremonies may still have been performed, only farther apart. A sacred place does not die immediately in the consciousness of its people. It dies in stages. One courtyard no longer used. One gate no longer opened as often. One room no longer repaired when the plaster begins to peel. A path gathering dust. A stair carrying fewer footprints. And those are exactly the kinds of details that chill us most when we imagine Chogha Zanbil. Because they show that the death of a sacred center does not always come through violent destruction. It can come through diminished care. Through the moment when people no longer pour their full spirit into it. Through the moment when the world has quietly turned its attention elsewhere. Imagine an old priest who had known the city in its brilliant age. He had seen incense thicken the air on festival nights. He had heard crowds coming in from far-off places. He had stood in packed courts and felt so strongly that the gods were near, the very atmosphere seemed heavier. And now he walks those same familiar passageways one evening. In an unusual stillness. Fewer torches. Fewer people. Some shrines closed. A wall left unrepaired. A wide court empty. And in the middle of it all, the ziggurat still stands, but the way it stands has changed. Not its shape. The invisible field around it. Perhaps he could not have put the feeling into words. But surely he knew that what was leaving this place was not just people, but the collective faith that had once made it live. That is what makes this chapter of the story hurt more than many ruins. Chogha Zanbil was not abandoned the way a warehouse is abandoned after it no longer serves a purpose. It was abandoned the way a heart loses blood. And when a heart stops beating, the body remains for a while. But the life has already withdrawn. The walls had not yet fallen. The ziggurat still stood. The bricks bearing Untash Gal's name were still built into the structure. But the warmth had begun to leave. And when warmth leaves places that once lived by ritual, they become cold in a very particular way. Not like an empty house. Not like an old marketplace. Not like a barracks after the soldiers have gone. They become cold as if they still retain the memory of prayer, of sacrificial blood, of arms once lifting offerings upward. But no longer have anyone left who can awaken that memory. Then the years passed. The winds of Khuzestan continued to blow. The sun continued to fall mercilessly on the brick. Walls that had once been maintained now had to endure alone. Plaster peeled farther. Brick edges chipped away. Dust began gathering in corners no one swept anymore. Tough little desert grasses may have found footholds in the cracks. Where there are no footsteps, time enters first. That is the ancient rule of all ruins. When people step out, time steps in. And at Chogha Zanbil, time must have stepped in very slowly, very patiently, like a first guest arriving while the owners had not yet fully admitted they were really gone. There may have been a long stretch when the sacred city existed in a half-living, half-dead state, not wholly deserted, not truly maintained, a state more painful than final collapse. Because everything in that stage carries the feeling of incompletion. Enough remains to remember what it once was. Not enough remains to keep it that way. Anyone who still came there must have felt the thinning in the air. The walls seeming wider because fewer voices filled them. The courtyards emptier because the ritual calendar no longer pressed as tightly upon them. The ziggurat higher, lonelier, because all the life that had once gathered around it in faith was falling away. A sacred center, when it loses its support, becomes lonely before it becomes ruined. And perhaps Chogha Zanbil lived long enough inside that loneliness for the place itself to seem aware of it. In a late-night telling like this, it becomes easy to imagine one last evening without anyone knowing it is the last. The sun reddening over the plain, light sweeping across the ziggurat's terraces. A few remaining people finishing some final task. A temple door being shut. A sacred flame going dark. One last prayer spoken without anyone realizing it will never be spoken there again. Wind rising gently. Dust moving in thin currents at the foot of the walls. Night falling. Morning still comes after that. But perhaps from that day, or one not far from it, Chogha Zanbil was no longer properly awakened. No one lit enough fires. No one opened enough doors. No one believed strongly enough to keep the city living as a center. A place like that does not die with a roar. It dies when one morning too few people return. And then time began doing what it does best. It turned absence into landscape. Where people no longer live. Wind lives. Where ritual no longer happens. Dust gathers. Where no orders are given for repair. The sun and the rare rain begin their work. Every summer, the bricks heat and cool again. Every gust bites a little more from the edges of the walls. Every space left untouched by human feet becomes an invitation to grass and sand. And what is most painful is that all of this happens without any great noise. No tragedy worthy of immediate record. Only slow wearing away. Only thinning. Only that once great monument withdrawing deeper into silence in the middle of the plain. Like a god whose name is forgotten but who still refuses to disappear. Picture Chogha Zanbil now. No incense. No processions. No prayers. Only wind moving through passageways once marked by ritual footsteps. Only the sun beating down on bricks once lit by lamps and ceremony. Only the immense sky pressing upon the ziggurat like one great silence. And it is there that the monument begins to take on a different kind of beauty. The beauty of something no longer used for its original purpose. But still refusing to become meaningless. Because even abandoned, Chogha Zanbil never became small. It still stood. It still had weight. It still forced anyone who saw it to understand that this had once been something far too large for a single life. For a single dynasty. Perhaps even for a whole civilization. And it is exactly that surviving largeness that makes its abandonment so overwhelming. Perhaps the people living in nearby lands in later generations began to look at the place differently. No longer as a living sacred center, but as an old place. A place no one could fully explain anymore. A place both grand and quiet, inspiring curiosity and caution in equal measure. Every great ruin gathers around itself a kind of field. Because when people no longer preserve the full memory of a monument, imagination begins to fill the gaps. There may have been whispered stories, tales that the gods had departed, that a curse lingered there, that the place had been drained of its spirit. We do not know. But a site like Chogha Zanbil was almost certainly never regarded merely as a pile of old brick. Its past was too large. And things too large, when they fall, always leave behind a field strong enough to unsettle those who stand near them. The more we think about it, the clearer it becomes that the mystery of Chogha Zanbil does not lie simply in the question of who built it, but in the question of how a place once so thoroughly central to sacred life could be left to wind and sun. Because to abandon a place like that requires more than physical weakening. It requires a rupture in meaning. At some point, the bond tying the monument to the living flow of human life must have snapped, or at least loosened so far it could no longer hold. And a rupture in meaning is often more painful than a fracture in stone. Stone can be rebuilt. Meaning, once there is no one left to sustain it through belief, is far harder to call back. Perhaps that is why Chogha Zanbil today carries such a distinctive sadness. It is not only ruined architecture. It is a place where meaning was once so full it overflowed into every part of the space. And then slowly drained away. And then, over the centuries, abandonment became silence. Real silence. No one left who remembered it fully. No ritual left linking the past to the present. Chogha Zanbil withdrew from living time and sank into the deeper layer of earth. broken memory, and buried history, but even left there amid the red dust and hot wind of Khuzestan. It refused to become anonymous. It remained like a mass of unresolved memory, like a closed door before which later generations could only stand and wonder what had once existed on the other side. And perhaps it was precisely from the moment the sacred city was left alone on the plain that Chogha Zanbil entered its second life, the life of mystery. And from the moment Chogha Zanbil entered that second life, the life of mystery, time no longer merely passed by it. Time began sitting down there, staying there, settling over each layer of brick, each stair, each empty court, each wall no longer hearing human footsteps. Like a slow guest who never leaves. Some places are destroyed so quickly by war that they almost never have time to acquire the soul of ruin. But Chogha Zanbil was different. It did not vanish all at once. It receded into the earth, into the dust, into one blazing season after another. Into the hot winds sweeping over Khuzestan, into the slow patient abrasion of nature. And it is precisely because it vanished so slowly that it accumulated a deeper silence than many other ruins, a silence not empty, but dense with unspoken memory, as if every layer of soil that covered it did not erase the past, but pressed it farther down. Imagine hundreds of years passing over that plain. No priests, no offerings, no king, no one left who truly understands why the place had once been built. Only the sun moving through day after day, pouring fire over the old brick. Only the wind rising across open ground, carrying red dust, fine sand, and the dry smell of the plain. Only one season resting upon the next, until corners of walls began to break away. Courts filled little by little with silted earth. Stair lines blurred, and the ziggurat that had once been the center of a whole world began being dragged back toward the ground. But the strange thing is that even in that process, Chogha Zanbil never became small. Ruined, yes. Forgotten, yes, but never invisible. It still retained enough body to remind the world that something immense had once happened there. Perhaps in those silent centuries, the people who lived nearby looked at the site with a mixture of curiosity and unease. A mass of architecture that large, even if no one remembered the names of the gods once worshipped there, could never be mistaken for ordinary ground. Great ruins always keep a certain field around themselves. They force human beings to imagine, even when exact knowledge is gone. Perhaps people told one another vague stories, that kings of a forgotten age had once lived there. That under those mounds lay departed gods. That the place had been abandoned because of some catastrophe no one wished to name. That there were hours of the day when one should not come too close. That at night the wind through the old walls sounded like voices in a language no one understood. We have no certain record of such local tales. But it is almost impossible to believe that a place like Chogha Zanbil sank into silence without gathering a halo of mystery around it. And that is what makes this part of the story beautiful in such a sad way. Because when formal knowledge recedes, human memory does not disappear completely. It changes form. It passes from ritual into rumor, from history into legend, from prayer into whisper. What people once understood clearly in the age of splendor can no longer be touched with certainty. And yet for that very reason the place begins living in another way, as a secret in the plain. Something no one can fully explain and yet no one can quite ignore. Chogha Zanbil moved from sacred city into a place of warning, then into broken memory, then into a shape on the horizon that made travelers glance back. Sometimes, in fact, the things that survive longest in communal memory are exactly the things no one fully understands anymore. Try to picture late afternoons on that land, when the sun is almost gone, when the sky over Khuzestan turns dull yellow-brown and then slowly red, when the wind stays low and long over the ground. In that light, the broken masses of Chogha Zanbil must have appeared like the bones of some vast creature that died long ago but had never fully sunk into the earth. There are no people there now. No torches. No offerings. But that very emptiness allows the shape of the monument to show itself in another way. When all the living layers are withdrawn, what remains is the bare skeleton of human ambition. And sometimes it is that stripped skeleton that chills us even more than the original glory. Because it reminds us that there was once a will large enough to raise this brick mountain. Once a faith strong enough to pour an entire kingdom's spiritual life into it. And that all of it was reduced in the end to walls, earth, wind, and a question that will not go silent. It may well be that centuries after its abandonment, Chogha Zanbil had sunk under far thicker layers of soil than we usually imagine. Lower portions of the sacred city gradually buried, courts filled, corridors disappeared beneath silt, doors, if they had been made of wood or other perishable material, vanished long before. Only the biggest, hardest, most stubborn structures continued to show above the accumulating earth. That transformation made the place look more like an artificial hill than a city. And that altered form only deepened the mystery. Because an unusual mound on a flat plain always compels the question, what lies beneath? Today we call it an archaeological ruin. But for centuries, to people with no tools to dig or texts to read, it must have looked like a secret sleeping beneath the ground, a body the earth had swallowed almost entirely. But not quite enough to stop it from calling to the eye. If we stay with this story long enough, we begin to feel a special sadness in the fact that Chogha Zanbil lay silent for so long. Not for a few generations. Not for a few short centuries. But for millennia. A stretch of time long enough for languages to change. Empires to rise and collapse. Religions to replace one another on that land. While the site itself remained there under the sun. Under the dust. Beneath the indifferent footsteps of generations who no longer truly knew what they were passing. It reminds us of something almost painful. The world is very good at continuing. Even when the greatest sacred centers go dark, crops still rise elsewhere, other cities still live, other powers still fight and pray. Only the ruin stays behind, holding the memory of what has been lost like a coal no longer burning but still holding deep heat for anyone patient enough to touch it. Perhaps that is why Chogha Zanbil is not only the story of Elam. It becomes a story about what time does to everything that once wanted to be immortal. It tells us that being built on a grand scale is no guarantee of being remembered rightly. That being dedicated to the gods is no guarantee someone will always speak your name. That being the center of one age does not mean you will not be pushed to the margins of the next. But it also tells us something gentler and more enduring, that some things, even when forgotten in knowledge, are not entirely forgotten in feeling. Chogha Zanbil is one of those things. It may have lost its name in ordinary life for long stretches of time. But its shadow remained strong enough to persist. Strong enough not to dissolve into the plain as if it had never existed. Strong enough that when later people finally came back and began to dig, they did not uncover a meaningless pile of bricks. They uncovered a silence too large, too shaped, too full of questions. There are many nights when I think of that silence as a kind of sleep. Not the ordinary sleep of something that will wake again the next morning, but a sleep so long that sleep itself becomes another form of existence. Chogha Zanbil slept beneath the earth in just that way. Asleep, but not dead. Asleep, but still holding its structure. Asleep, while still letting a few outlines rise above the surface so that people would know something unusual lay below. Perhaps that is why, even today, when we look at the remaining terraces and brickwork, the place does not feel finished. It feels interrupted, a world cut off from the living order and forced to wait. Not for the people of its own age to return, but for people from a much later age to come and ask, "Who were you? And how did you live before you fell silent for so long?" And that question had really been there all along during those ages of silence. It was simply that no one could ask it properly anymore, or no longer had the language to ask it. But the earth kept the answer in its own way. Earth does not speak. It buries. It keeps. It presses layers of the past downward without erasing them completely. And the more we think about the earth in that way, the more we realize that Chogha Zanbil was not only buried by nature. It was also stored by it. Stored coldly, without mercy, yet not entirely cruelly. Because if the earth were only a destroyer, there would be nothing left for the future to uncover. But earth both conceals and preserves. It pushes the lost farther from human sight so that when it rises again, it does so with the aura of something reborn. So this chapter of the story, the chapter of the long millennia of silence beneath the soil of Khuzestan, should not be told as an empty gap between the age of splendor and the modern excavation. It is a chapter of its own. A chapter in which Chogha Zanbil learned to exist as compressed memory. It no longer needed pilgrims. No longer needed priests. No longer needed kings. It needed only time to continue passing across it, for absence itself to thicken, deepen, and become so profound that silence became the place's new essence. And perhaps only monuments that once lived with tremendous force can endure such a long silence without dissolving completely. But however silent it became, nothing can bury a question that large forever. Sooner or later, after centuries and centuries, people of a very different age began looking at the mounds, the bricks, the strange surviving walls in the plain, and realized that beneath them there was not only old dirt. Beneath them was a civilization, a dream, a sacred city, a king's vow to the gods. And at that moment Chogha Zanbil began moving from its life of silence into its third life, the life of excavation, scholarship, and modern imagination, trying to reassemble a world that had slept too long. But before we step into that, we should remain one beat longer with the final image of this silent age, the wide, hot plain of Khuzestan, the wind passing over it as though nothing had ever been there. While beneath the earth Chogha Zanbil lies still, keeping within itself the footsteps, prayers, incense, and all the lost brightness of a vanished world, like a dream not yet fully gone from the soil. And then, after thousands of years lying still like a buried dream, after countless summers blazing over Khuzestan, After all the winds carrying dust across the plain without knowing they were moving over the memory of an extinguished world. Chogha Zanbil began to live again, not as the sacred city of Elam, not as the place where gods were summoned down with incense and prayer, but as a mystery awakening in the modern age. A question made of brick that people today bend down to study and still cannot fully answer. Perhaps that is the strangest thing of all about places like this. They do not die only once. They change forms of life. From sacred center into ruin. From ruin into mute legend. From mute legend into archaeological site. And then, beyond archaeology, into a mirror in which modern humanity can look at itself and ask about memory, power, belief, and the fragility of all the things once thought eternal. When the layers of earth began to be opened again, when the walls, the courts, the terraces of the Ziggurat slowly re-emerged beneath the light of a radically different age, there must have been a feeling very hard to name. Not only discovery, not only scientific excitement, but something like awakening a thing that had slept too long. The archaeologists did not uncover mere fired brick. They uncovered hardened will. They uncovered the name of Untash Gal appearing in inscriptions. They uncovered proof that this was not some accidental mound, but the heart of a sacred city raised with extraordinary seriousness and belief. And the more they uncovered, the more they read, the more they fit together, the more they understood that Chogha Zanbil was not merely a surviving monument. It was one of the rarest doors leading directly into the soul of Elam, a civilization the modern world knows only too dimly, too fragmentarily, too incompletely. And yet even here, the mystery of Chogha Zanbil did not end. It only changed its questions. Once, the mystery was why it had been built, and why it had been abandoned. Today, the mystery also includes this: just how large a place it truly occupied in the lived imagination of the Elamites. How deep its rituals really ran. What kind of faith moved through its courts, its terraces, its gates. In what tone the names of its gods were spoken. What the people who once walked through it felt when they looked up at the ziggurat in the early light or under nighttime torches. And deeper still, what broke so profoundly that a sacred center like this could fall out of the living rhythm of an entire civilization? Archaeology can open the ground, measure walls, read inscriptions, reconstruct materials, but there are silences that no spade of science can fully penetrate. And it is those silences that allow Chogha Zanbil to remain a true mystery. If we sit with it long enough, we begin to understand that this monument tells us not only about Elam, but about humanity itself, about the instinct to build things larger than ourselves in order to resist forgetting, about the belief that if we build high enough, beautiful enough, sacred enough, time may perhaps touch us more gently, about the fact that even the strongest centers can have their spirit slowly drawn out of them by history without the people inside noticing it first. And about another truth, softer but more enduring, that things once truly loved, once believed in, once poured into with all the force of a civilization, can still leave behind a field that lasts in the earth for a very long time. Even after abandonment, Chogha Zanbil is that kind of field. It prevents later generations from seeing it as a mere heap of old brick. It forces them to feel, almost by instinct, that this place was once a heart, once a living rhythm, once a place where an entire civilization tried to speak to heaven. Perhaps that is why, even today, standing before Chogha Zanbil brings such a particular sadness. Not sadness at ruin in general, but sadness at a place built out of too much faith. Ruins made simply for dwelling, once broken, leave behind mostly the story of ordinary human life. But places built for gods, for permanence, for memory beyond the span of a single lifetime, when they fall, they make us feel much more sharply the finiteness of all things. Chogha Zanbil once tried to bind earth to heaven. Now it lies low upon the plain, reminding us that every human effort to rise must still pass through the judgment of time. Yet at the same time, it tells us the opposite as well, that not everything finite is meaningless. Because although Chogha Zanbil did not defeat oblivion entirely, neither was it utterly lost. It is still here, still large enough to force the future to return. And perhaps, for a monument that slept for millennia, that is already a kind of quiet victory. If we look even more deeply, we begin to see that the greatest mystery of Chogha Zanbil does not lie in any single archaeological question, but in the feeling it leaves behind, the sense that somewhere among these bricks, dust, and light, something still hangs in the air that has not fully dissolved, something from Elam that has not completely left the world. Perhaps it is the old faith. Perhaps the ambition of Untash Gal. Perhaps the prayers no one speaks anymore, but whose echo still clings to the brick. Or perhaps the silence itself, after becoming so dense over such a long time, has given the place a second soul, the soul of the ruin. A soul that no longer demands worship, but demands listening. And if you listen long enough, quietly enough, Chogha Zanbil seems always to be asking the same question. What is it in human life that truly lasts, brick? Power, name, or the sheer intensity of belief once poured into them? Perhaps that is why, in the end, Chogha Zanbil is not only the story of ancient Iran, it is the story of the way human beings build ladders toward heaven and then have to watch them become ruins. It is the story of the beauty of sacred ambition and the sorrow of that ambition failing to preserve the world around it. It is the story of a holy city forgotten, and in being forgotten, becoming an even stronger symbol of the fragility of glory. And it is also the story of memory itself. How memory sometimes does not live from generation to generation on human lips, but sleeps inside earth, brick, in silence until another age comes close enough, curious enough, humble enough to kneel down and ask. And if I had to bring this story to a close in the voice of an old man speaking deep into the night, I do not think I would close it with a final answer. Chogha Zanbil is not the kind of mystery that was ever meant to be solved once and for all. I would close it with an image. A very late afternoon on the Khuzestan plain. The wind moving low, the sun leaning westward, the old bricks holding the last light of day in muted brown-red tones. No priests, no offerings, no king. No incense smoke rising in bands. Only the ziggurat, worn down by time but still standing, like the last surviving spine of an ancient dream. And in that silence, we understand that the greatest mystery of Chogha Zanbil is not only why it was abandoned, but why something dead for so long can still slow the heartbeat of the living. Perhaps it is because things built out of the deepest belief are never completely lost. They simply change their form of existence, from sacred city to ruin, from ruin to memory, from memory to story, And from story to a long echo each generation must hear again through its own loneliness, curiosity, and mortality.